So welcome everybody. So we have a wonderful panel here today, and I'm super excited to discuss surrogacy in New York. I think we have some of the best experts here. So I want to jump right in because I have a feeling we could probably talk for 2 hours about this with some introductions. So Dr. Pinho, so excited to have you here. I've known you for many, many years. You're one of the best. So you are the medical director at Reproductive Centers of America. So super excited for that. And then I'm going to scoot right on over to Molly, amazing attorney as well. She's partner, International Fertility Law Group. So thank you for joining us. We're really excited to hear all about this. And then of course, Perla, she's the executive vice president here at Family Source. So I think we have an amazing team here. So like I said, I want to jump right in because I think that we're really we could probably talk about this all day. So let's start out, if you don't mind, Molly. We're going to start with you on some of the legalities here in New York, because I think just from hearing people talk in our field, in our industry, they think it's pretty just a cut and dry process in New York in February when we're able to launch that. Can you give us a little feedback and
Sure.
enlighten us with what are some of the realities to expect?
Yes. Okay. So it's a fabulous step forward that New York has legalized compensated surrogacy. The fact that New York had a long-standing ban on this for a very long time, and New York is a progressive state in so many ways. And so it's amazing that they've come to this. And my personal hope is that other states follow suit, because this is a good step forward. I think it's important to note right now that there is a cleanup bill coming, because there are a few discrepancies within the bill, how it's written. It's the most detailed surrogacy law I have ever read for any state or any country. And with that, you're naturally going to have a couple of things that do this. So they're working on the cleanup bill now. It has not been presented. So there will be some changes. This is not the final, if that makes sense. But it's a beautiful step forward. It's incredibly detailed. It has wonderful provisions and very notable provisions, which I think we'll eventually go into.
Yeah, and I think too, like you said, it's such a wonderful step ahead, given obviously the past history. So, and that's as well. And once this does open up to the United States in February, like you had mentioned, there may be some tweaks along the way. And I think that's interesting, because it's not, do you feel that it's not really super set in stone yet in terms of the legality, or?
Well, no, they're definitely keeping the legality for sure. I don't see that changing. There's certain provisions within the bill itself that are perhaps a little murky. And as people have started discussing them and deciding, okay, so how do we make this work? We're realizing that there might need to be some clarity on some points. And also a few things just so that it's the intent of the statute is really found in there.
Yeah. So we're really excited. It's such a wonderful step forward for so many people.
It's huge, yeah.
It's huge. It's huge for all of us. I feel like we've been waiting forever, and here it is. So it's super exciting.
It took them over 10 years to do all of this, and their hard work is evident in the bill. So
a lot of passionate people put their heart and soul into this. So really exciting. So Dr. Pinho, over to you. I'm so excited to hear about the medical aspect, because again, same with what Molly had mentioned, there's some restrictions. So I would love for you to discuss that with us in terms of who can use a surrogate and all of that medically wise.
Thank you for having me. This is a wonderful panel. I just wanted to mention additionally that Molly and her group has been very proactively involved in not only the changing, I know that we don't self-indulge in mentioning sometimes important things, but they have been actively extremely involved in the changing of the law, and many of the things that have been portrayed right now have been a result of her and her group that have actually made those changes happen. Surrogacy. Surrogacy has been a lot difficult throughout the United States, especially in the region of the 80s. Reminding that when it came the 80s to 90s, there's a couple of cases that actually determined all the changes that happened in New York. One of them was the change where there was a case of what is called traditional surrogacy. And I mentioned this because it will be kind of the development for all the stages that we need for the clinical portion of surrogacy, where traditional surrogate means that the woman that is going to carry the baby is going to be also the woman that is going to provide the egg. So there is a double genetic factor where she would be associated. And that created a case, very well written. I won't go into it in details, but it created a lot of hassles. It created an impediment, not only in that state, but there was a follow suit in several other states, inclusive New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and so forth. And that created also an impediment for what we call these days gestational surrogacy. So a little bit of a difference. You're going to be an intended parent. You would like to have your own child or children, and there is going to be a genetic attachment that you're going to have with that child. It's going to be either from a partner that you have, which there is eggs that it's going to be associated with that, or it's going to be maybe an egg donor. And in that respect, that's what we call gestational carrier, because there is no attachment of any genetics of the gestational carrier to the child itself that is going to be born. I'll go just a couple of seconds and I'll kind of, touch base with Molly and with Staci and Perla. There is 3 phases of any gestational process. The first one, you're going to find it, oh, but it's obvious. It's the stage that you are right now. It's the stage of decision. I want to initiate this. The reason that most of the folks, you can be, a single dad, you can be a heterosexual couple, you can be a same-sex couple, and the same doubt appears to everyone that needs surrogacy. Is it going to be safe? That's the first question. I have an accent because I'm from the European kind of conjugate differential from here. I'm originally from Portugal, an intended parent myself, and I had the same questions, which is, how is it going to be safe for me to abdicate in so many levels of what we consider so important, which is the control of a pregnancy? And I know that we all control freaks in some sort of way, but it's such an important decision. So that decision is going to be the first question. And then the second question is, well, I'm from New York, or I'm not from New York, or I'm an internationally intended parent, and I'm going to be able to do this where? Can I do this in New York? Can I do this in Connecticut, Los Angeles, whatever it is that you decide to do? And the answer is, New York has opened the surrogacy world for the intended parents that are citizens of the United States that live there for approximately 6 months. I'm mentioning this, and Molly mentions something extremely important. There's going to be a lot of cleanup. There's going to be a lot of alterations, probably throughout the months and years of this law that is being implemented right now. But the most important factor is that there is a limitation. So if you're an internationally intended parent and you would like to do a surrogacy journey in New York, well, you can do the screening in New York. You can do actually even the egg donor portion of creation of the embryos in New York. But if you're looking for a continuum, and I work in Connecticut and I work also in New York with the intended parents, that probably if you're going to be international, you probably should have a lot better chances in Connecticut. And that's a perfect conjugation that we have with Staci and Perla that I've worked for years, and with Molly, where, all the steps are going to be very seamless. What is the second and third decision? I mentioned there are 3 things. The second decision is, well, you're going to have to choose the way that you want to do this. You're an intended parent, you live more than 6 months. Could you have a gestational carrier? Does it have to be a gestational carrier from New York itself? Does it have to be a gestational carrier from Pennsylvania or New Jersey? Can it be then the transfer if I live in New York and I have all the criteria to be done in New York? Can I have a surrogate from elsewhere? You can. So those questions are going to be answered very easy. The third one is, well, what is going to be my journey? And this is, I think, as important as the first decision, which you're looking at. I have 3 children. They're here somewhere. And it's difficult to visualize what you initially want when you start. But when you start, you want, as I wanted, 36 years old, I want immensely to be a parent. I just want to be a parent. I don't care even, sorry to say, but, there is a little bird that leaves, one of those Paris birds that leaves on my foot doorstep kind of thing, a baby, and I'll take it. I mean, this is the zone where most intended parents are. They're anxious. They want to do this as soon as possible. And they are looking and focus only on that journey. And it's a process. It's expensive. It has a lot of, mechanisms that we have to go through. And there is where I really want to mention Molly and Staci and Perla on the other side, which is the safety of doing this process in the United States. There's a lot of gateways, and I'll leave that for both of my colleagues over here on the 2 different sites that I supervise in the clinical portion, where one side is going to be the contracts that you're going to do, but preemptively you're going to have a possible match. You will have certain criteria that we can discuss a little bit later, and you want this person to take a pawn for your journey. You're going to meet preemptively, maybe on a Zoom, maybe a Skype these days, even more so with COVID. It's going to be at a distance. And then that process comes to me where I'm already touching base with all this team over here, reviewing medical records, knowing everything on paper, 300, 400 pages, which I go every single detailed page I have to read and go through, and we have this conjugation. Now, I can tell you that not all agencies are, agencies that I would have a know-how of being relieved because they have done their work. And I can tell you that, the agency that is here, it is someone in a body of person that I completely trust. And Molly on doing the contracts that are going to be necessary either for the egg donor and for the gestational carrier in terms of representation. When I finish with my clinical part at the station that, she's going to be well for all this process, that's when, all the important things take over, which is what is your needs? What do you want to do during that pregnancy? What are the rules and regulations that you would see fit for you to feel even more safeguard and secure and, well with the decision that you made? That's where they come as a team. And me, I do my obligation job of getting everyone pregnant. That's what I'm here for. So I'll now relay this further steps, which are extremely important. We'll go even through some of the more details along this conversation on do's and don'ts and limitations, other limitations that I've not covered right now. But take it away, young ladies.
You know what, I had a question, if we can go backwards just a little bit. If you can, and Molly, you might want to jump in here as well, in terms of the international intended parents. I know you touched on that a little bit in terms of, obviously, surrogacy in New York. Can you explain a little bit more into detail, especially with so many of the international intended parents coming over from Europe, right? They love New York. So this, I'm sure this is super exciting for many of them. But can you touch on, now, are you referring to maybe the safer route with a surrogate not being residing in New York? Or let's say a surrogate is elsewhere. Let's say the surrogate lives in, hypothetically, Illinois. Can she still have the embryo transfer then in New York? Because I know now they typically don't do the transfer, so they can.
Right. That restriction, or if you took a really strict reading of the current law, a lot of people weren't comfortable with embryo transfers. Some people weren't. I think that there is a valid argument that you kind of probably could do embryo transfers, but the requirement, if you don't mind me jumping in for a second, both parties need to be U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents. So the intended parents and the surrogate. Now, the question of residency, as Dr. Pinho correctly pointed out, is one of those sections they're probably going to have to tweak in the law, because it's not totally clear and it does contradict itself later on in the law. So the surrogate can live in New York, and if they're going to rely on her residency in order to file the case in New York, then she has to have lived there for 6 months. Or the intended parents can be residents of New York and have lived there for 6 months.
So it can be either or.
Right. But there's a spot later in the law where it makes that maybe perhaps a little bit murky, where it says, well, if the parents haven't lived there for 6 months, then X, Y, and Z applies. So I think that's one of the parts they're going to be working on. It's not totally clear at this point, but I would safely say make the surrogate live there if you're going to be doing a surrogacy based in New York. But doing embryo transfers, to answer your question, as far as I'm concerned with the reading of the law, absolutely fine.
Perfect. So those restrictions should be completely lifted.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And the beauty of New York is where it's placed, particularly New York City. It's so close to many other states, like Connecticut, where Dr. Pinho works. It'd be a piece of cake to have a surrogate in any of those surrounding areas. She can easily get in for an embryo transfer and go back home. It's not like a state like Texas or Colorado or California, where the state is so large, you're looking at significant travel to get there.
Right.
Yeah.
East Coast, they all kind of blend together, it seems to be. So travel is much easier. Can you go over, and again, this might be for both of you, the requirements for needing and utilizing a surrogate? Because each state is so different in terms of, maybe some states you have to have there has to be a medical necessity, and some don't. So is that something that we can discuss too to educate the?
It's a great one for Dr. Pinho.
Okay,
I was gonna,
Okay, I'll initiate at least.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give kind of a little bit of a brush with a state that I lived in. For two reasons, which is Texas. And the second reason is not only because I lived there and I actually did my Baylor residency over there, but because parenting can be very complicated depending on the state and depending on the relation status that you have yourself. If you're a single dad and you want to do surrogacy in the state of Texas, in the state of New York, in the state of Connecticut, in the state of New Jersey or Pennsylvania for that fact, they all have a little bit of different nuances. It depends, for example, where you also live in, because if you're an internationally intended parent, there's a lot of, this is why it's so important to have the right team that we have over here. If you're a parent that lives in France, it's going to be something different than a parent that is going to live in Germany. And the reason is going to be twofold, that we sometimes only focus on one side, which is, and we're focusing correctly because there's a lot of changes in New York that we are, focusing right now. But for intended parents that live, for example, in Germany, they're going to need a certain number of documentation that portrays more, if you're a single intended parent in Germany, more to the side of adoption when the child returns to their country, in comparison, for example, to Spain or to France, which there is a lot of differences actually between the two countries. The reason that I'm mentioning this is, let's simplify all this with the initial statement that I did. You're in Texas and you're a single parent, and can you do it in Texas? You can, but there is certain laws in Texas that privilege the surrogate in regards, for example, to the contracts, or even in cases of dispute, comparing, for example, to Connecticut, and in this case, for also New York. When they changed the law in New York, they did one marvelous thing, because back in the 80s, like I was saying, the 88 and 1992 case, that actually, the law that changed actually in 92, they restricted every intended parent from single, same sex, everything was restricted. And when they open up, they didn't only open up for a certain sector of intended parents, either you're an heterosexual couple, either, you can be even whatever status that you want to be, it is permissible. So in New York right now, first things first is rules and regulations, limitations for, is that the gestational carrier that lives either in New York or doesn't live in New York, if you're an intended parent and you're single, you have a good chance of doing a surrogacy very safely without no restrictions. You don't have to go back into the law and actually change your contracts or anything, because the provision of the law already accommodates that. Now, a little bit further along, because if you're an intended parent, here's going to be if you're going into the surrogacy world and you're already an intended parent, most of you that are watching right now, you've already done a lot of research, probably. You already know a lot of the donation portion of it, but you yourself as a sperm donor, you are considered a donor. And that's something that is confusing for intended parents, because they say, well, I'm not a donor. Wait a minute, I'm really not a donor. I'm the intended parent for my own self. How can I be a donor for my own self? Well, when we're using what we call third party means, there is the necessity of somebody else outside from your realm or your relationship realm, which means you can be, you're in an heterosexual relationship, your wife or spouse cannot have or the possibility of carrying the pregnancy, then you're going to need somebody else. You need an egg donor, you're going to need somebody else. You need a sperm donor, the same thing. And when you're doing your sperm collection, if you're doing it for your own self, for the statutes of the law, you're still a sperm donor. You're still what we call a gamete donor. Gametes are either sperm or eggs. So for the state of New York, as many other states, what happens is that there is a restriction over there that I want to make sure that also intended parents know about it, because it differs from state to state, which is Connecticut doesn't have the same restriction, which is there is a mandatory quarantine for the sperm, and there's a waiver that can be actually done for it. But there is also testing that needs to be accommodated, and there's a little bit of work there. It's not you as an intended parent will have nothing to do, because that's the background work that Molly, Staci, and Perla and I will be doing, which is we have to create this waiver first. We test you as an egg donor or a sperm donor, and then we are going to make sure that that testing is also validated. When that test is validated also through a physical examination, to testing all the infectious diseases. All those processes are going to be clinically my portion of it. When I say, well, we have sufficient cause for an exclusion where you send your sperm, and we can talk maybe later about this. For example, you're in Spain, and we can create a vehicle of you not being able to travel, and we can create that vehicle where sperm can travel to us already tested in a certain way, and we'll talk about it. Then I have to create an attestation that you as a sperm donor or somebody else as an egg donor has sufficiently caused that won't alter the risk for infectious disease or any other genetic conditions that would implement a cause and effect immediately, so that you would be deterred from actually doing this in the future. Because certain intended parents, they believe that sometimes the process is linear. It is, but we need to do those checkpoints. One further thing for sperm donors and all of this, what is this thing of waiver that you're talking about? It's something frequently that I have the intended parents. You're talking very well, but I didn't understand the waiving part. What is that? Is I'm advocating for my rights? No. What we're attesting is that there is a rule and regulation, still very much older, especially between the days of HIV and HTLV, which were viruses that we were very worried at the time. And so to create and to make sure that the process was safe in infertility, we would test and then we would retest again because the testing was actually not very good. And so we needed those 6 months, what we called kind of a window. And that's the reason why it was created, those 6 months. Having said that, that is a portion that we can make safely. And yes, there is no 0% for anything because, you know, in statistics there, yes, anything can happen, but it's a safe process. When the doctor, your physician, Dr. X can be me, can be another physician, attests that, listen, you are safe to do this, and the egg donor is safe to do this, then we can proceed. Sperm, once it's frozen, is valid for several hundred years. I'm sure no one of the intended parents that is probably listening to this is thinking that it's going to take that long, and there's going to be consents too. That's the last part where I want to segue with my colleagues over here, which is informed consent. It's not only to tell you the goodness of all that we're doing, but prepare. I usually say, I prepare for the worst, I expect the best, and we maintain a very strict line because that's what it keeps us very focused in a very successful journey. You should need, you know, more than 1 or 2 transfers to have your child, yes, but because many things were done until that point. The segue of informed consent is to tell you about all the things that can happen throughout all this process and how we're going to make this process safe. And that part is hugely done by the two groups over here, which is between Molly and the legal part, and also Staci, which is make sure that not only your gestational carrier is sane, is, you know, there's a psychological evaluation, there is a social evaluation, there is so many things that are done that I need also to approve, that it ends up with the contracts, and the contracts are just a finalization of all these other points. Seamlessly, there are, again, 3 decisions. You need to choose to start, you need to start the process and see what you are going to want. And last part is your journey. You know, are you going to want 1 child, 2 children, or maybe freeze those embryos just in case because you might change your mind later.
Thank you so much. And that brings me to a question then for Molly in terms of the requirements, the contract requirements to be a surrogate, even in the state of New York. Is there anything that's out of the ordinary, or if you can just go over that list, that would be super helpful.
Yeah. Definitely. If it's okay, can I start by backtracking for one thing that Dr. Pinho pointed out that I'd like to flesh out for a second. New York does allow for all types of parents to become parents. You can be single, you can be married, you can be gay, straight, none of that matters. However, if you are married, but you are not living with your, like you and your spouse are not proceeding together, you need to take caution because there's a special subset of the law that says that person will still be considered a parent because the marital relationship is a legal one. And so that person will be considered a parent. So we would advise you to complete that divorce, have them move out, have a clear separation, or else they could be considered a parent. So if you're married but proceeding as a single parent, draw a clear line in the sand there so that your rights are protected. For the surrogates, one of the very cool things about this law, I'm kind of excited about it, is that they have this whole section called the Surrogate's Bill of Rights. And this talks about what the surrogate is entitled to, what she should get, what makes, you know, what the surrogate requirements are. Because they really, the people who drafted this law really wanted to protect surrogate mothers. They wanted to make sure that people looking at this law didn't see that, could never argue that people were taking advantage of a surrogate.
Right.
And I think they've done an excellent job of proving that. So a surrogate must be over the age of 21 years old. They must be healthy. They must have given birth to at least 1 child. Those kinds of basic requirements that are the same across any state here in the United States, as well as what any practitioner would have, right? But in the Surrogate's Bill of Rights, they also give the surrogate some other special things. One of those, as Dr. Pinho correctly pointed out, is that she gets a psychological consultation and she has access to psychological counseling throughout the journey. She is entitled to her own attorney, which is a requirement in some other states, but surprisingly not in every state. She has a requirement to have a life insurance policy that has at least $750,000 payable to her family. That's
Wow.
huge.
That's huge.
And yeah, now it does have a subset to that, and that says if she doesn't qualify for that much life insurance, then it can be lower. I don't know how that's regulated. That's one of those parts they're probably going to tweak
Yeah, I was
in
gonna
their
ask how
revisions.
it's going to be
Yeah.
regulated. Yeah,
She's
it'll be interesting.
must have medical insurance coverage that will protect her throughout the journey. And that insurance coverage must be kept in place for a full 12 months after the birth.
Okay.
So that is an
that's definitely a
additional
difference.
financial, right? That is a financial requirement the parents will have to meet. So it's important to kind of make sure that the parents are aware that their involvement goes long into the future with choosing a surrogate based in the state of New York. There's of course a lot of other things in the surrogate Bill of Rights, but those are some of the big highlights, I think.
Do you think that with that specific requirement in terms of the insurance being in place for 12 months post-birth, do you think that will then make it necessary then to extend how long the escrow account would remain opened? Because typically right now we have it 6 months post-birth, but this would make sense just to extend that then.
Right. It would. And I wonder how that would work if the surrogate had her own insurance during the pregnancy. That wasn't what the parents were paying for. And then we're post-birth and maybe 8 months in, she decides to move, or her husband changes jobs. And so now the insurance is changing.
Right.
How would you regulate that? What are the teeth in that? How is that followed up on? You know,
I see this being a possible situation to where in New York, for the surrogates who live in New York, that and ton of parents are probably going to really want or hope that that surrogate has her own insurance. It would obviously, help financially, but this is going to be interesting. But I think that's great that she does have, like you said, that Bill of Rights.
It literally is called the Bill of Rights, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, that is pretty cool. Yeah,
just to chime in on that.
No, go ahead.
Just to chime in on that, there is also one further reason for this insurance. When you do the waiver in New York, differently than maybe other states, you need to test the gestational carrier across a number of months. The statutes right now, they say 3 months, every 3 months, and they actually don't give a limitation on the number of months until you stop the testing. And they leave that a lot for the medical criteria, but that's also one of the reasons. So they're treating the waiver as, there could be a situation where you need to retest your gestational carrier just to have an attestation that that testing for, all the diseases that you're testing for are going to maintain itself negative. So it's a protection also for the gestational carrier over here. In terms of the escrow account, you're probably much more savvy than I ever could, because I deal with the medical part.
In terms of the escrow account, is there going to be any stipulation in where that escrow is held? Does that make any difference?
Yes. So it's an interesting law, or part of the law, and I think that this will also have some tweaking because it's a little bit confusing. It appears that it's pretty clear an attorney representing either party cannot hold escrow.
Okay.
I'm not totally clear on whether an attorney not representing one of the parties can hold escrow.
Okay.
An agency can hold escrow if the agency is owned or run by an attorney who is licensed in New York.
That seems like a whole ball of contradictions, doesn't it, kind of?
Like I said, they're working on a cleanup bill. You can also, of course, have a licensed and bonded escrow company as long as they're licensed and bonded. I think in the state of New York, I think they need licensing and bonding in New York. It's not specific in the escrow description, but there are a lot of places in this law where it says the licensure must be part of New York. So I would assume that they meant that here too and didn't intentionally write that out. But until we get the cleanup, right now that is a little murky.
Okay, great. again, though, it's just so amazing that this is even happening. So
Yeah.
the cleanup, we'll take that cleanup, right?
Yeah, we'll take it. Yeah. We'll take the fact that we have a law is incredible. I mean, it's
Make sure
amazing.
that we pass the right message also to our intended parents. It's already very well defined, the law.
Mm-hmm.
So the take-home message is, everything is already very, I mean, it's already clean in terms of the definitions.
Yeah.
We would like to further, when Molly and I say, and Staci and Perla say we want this law cleaned, is we want further permeability of doing the things that we know that there's going to be a question down the line.
Mm-hmm.
And we make sure that there's not even a question because it has been already addressed. But
Exactly.
the law is already there. It's safe. It's applicable. It's
detailed. We're there.
On the 15th of February, we're supposed to, have that starting date, which is, kind of a little bit more just, an illusion of what we can start. Preparation for that. This does not mean, and I want also to pass this message along, which is a lot of my intended parents that I've, consulted with throughout this, especially the last 2 months, they've been asking me, so I should wait until February to start this process. And
that was going to be my next question for both of you. Yeah, you beat me to it.
Sorry.
No?
That's a very frequent question. And I usually say this, there's a lot of preparatory work to be done until the moment that we can actually even start to think. All things lag between the moment that you have your match. It takes approximately about maybe a few weeks until we have the screening completely done. And then it takes about also a few weeks until your contracts, depending on what you want and your desires are. And then from that point, the transfer of the embryos that we have already created, because usually and often enough, the process starts with either retrieving your own eggs or having an egg donor cycle at that moment. And we have already the embryos. We already know genetically what they are, boys, girls, if they're euploids, means if they have the genetic components that we would like to be nominal instead of, of normal, more chromosomes like trisomy 21, which is the Down syndrome, and other defects that we can test, and we can test for many things. And at the moment that we have the gestational carrier, everything lags because you have the contracts, you're ready. In that moment, you say to yourself, okay, I'm ready to do this. Is it going to happen tomorrow? And it takes approximately 1.5 months to 2 months from the moment that we have the contract signed. Remember, all things need to be legal and presented, and all those little dots, we need to make sure that, they're already signed over. And that's what we take care of, and you make the decision, and we go through all the decisions with you. So you can start right now. You can start that process that, is going to lag, that you're going to create your embryos, takes, a couple of months until you create your embryos. And then from that point forward, you're going to have your transfer. You probably, if you want to become an intended parent already by next year and you're looking forward to do it in New York, start now. Not that this is, marketing saying, oh, listen, start now because you should. No, remember, everything lags, and most intended parents go through a process of 2, 3, at best 4 months before, all the pieces are put up together, sometimes longer, sometimes less if we have, depending on your case, and every case is different.
So Molly, in terms of the legal piece on that, can that not start then until February to actually draft the direct agreements?
Yeah, the draft can probably start ahead of time. I wouldn't have anybody sign it until after, because one of the requirements is that this contract be signed prior to medication start. And you don't necessarily want a signing date prior to the law being effective. There is an interesting thing I wanted to mention about agencies, because it's kind of come up a few times. Agencies need to be licensed in New York now, which is the first state to do this. And it's really interesting because the American Bar Association, the ABA, did pass a model act governing agencies and licensure for agencies. So this is really cool that New York noticed that.
I think that's great. I would love to have more regulations across the board, agency-wise.
the part that I'm not totally clear on quite yet is whether it's an agency that might have a primary place of business outside of the state of New York, but operates in New York, or if they are just based in New York. So I think it's anybody practicing in New York, no matter where they're based.
Okay.
And it's the New York Department of Health that will do that licensure. So I think that they're working behind the scenes right now to get that going, because I assume that as of February 15th, they're going to get a big pile of applications for that license. Yep.
I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and I've been talking to them, they're good, they're good people that have been working exhaustively, actually, also to try to change. Remember that there is so many things, and I was reviewing on the other day, there's the DRL, which is the domestic relations law, the family court. I mean, there's so many things that needed to change, that the DOH was another thing. I think and I don't want to misquote, but they're trying to get the application between the end of this year to January to have the application in ahead of time, at least rules and regulations for that. I don't want to misquote because they will kill me, because I don't have this in an official format, but I think they're working diligently to have that already. So for intended parents, it's not an issue. If there is an issue, if there is, and again, to clarify, if there is any impossibility of you not being able to do the process in New York, Connecticut, and I don't want to privilege Connecticut just because of privileging, but I'm going to state that probably, even against shooting myself on the foot, because I don't work in the other two states, but California, Nevada, and Connecticut are the most open states historically, because they were the first ones with laws that are very well defined. So if you need to have your journey and there is any issues whatsoever in terms of questionability, if we should do something, there is always the possibility of doing things in Connecticut, which is a few miles up. It's
got a backup plan.
Exactly. Yeah. It's an hour up. Actually, historically, it's an amazing place. Very clean air, I can tell you. I lived for almost 5 years in New York. I live in Riverdale, very beautiful, next to the Hudson River. Had a great time there, but Connecticut is a little bit less polluted.
A little less polluted, for sure.
But even more importantly, I think now everybody has the comfort of knowing that you can get pregnant. You can have an IVF transfer in New York with Dr. Pinho, and you don't have to, it doesn't matter where your surrogate lives. I mean, it'd be great if she can live there now too. She can live in Connecticut, she can live in anywhere around, but you can still go to him and get pregnant and not have to worry about if that's going to be a problem.
That is such, that's a bonus right there.
Yeah.
Even if the surrogate is not in New York. Oh yeah, that's great. Stemming from that, in terms of the parentage, Molly, for a pre-birth order, I'm assuming.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit and what goes into those details?
For sure. I'd like to talk about a couple of things that have to go into the contract, because the contract needs to be submitted to the court. So it's important that the contracts have certain things. I'm not going to hit on everything. It's a very long law, but I'm going to hit on some highlights that I think are interesting. One of them is about the surrogate compensation. So the surrogate, it's totally fine to compensate a surrogate in New York now, which is wonderful. It does say that the compensation must be reasonable and that it can be negotiated, but it does say negotiated in good faith. So that's something to note from an agency perspective and from an intended parent and surrogate perspective. How do we navigate those waters without people getting hurt feelings? Because in other states, surrogates say this is what my compensation is, but if it says it can be negotiated now, I worry about that causing issues. So that might be something we really want to educate everybody on. Having good expectations set on from the beginning.
I think that'll definitely be really fall on a lot of the agency responsibility up front.
Right.
Because we certainly don't want to be going back and forth between the surrogate and the intended parents, for sure. So,
Right. And this part, go ahead.
No. I just was going to add that many times, even from, without the New York ruling right now, most of the surrogates that we have, and I worked with Staci for years and Perla the same way, which is usually that's part of the initial assessment that the agency
Right.
does with the surrogate, saying, listen, what would be the reasonable compensation? And everyone is different for many, many different factors. There's so many factors in choosing your gestational carrier. I think that is already established and probably will be tweaked between better the lawyering part, which is going to be the lawyer part, which is you, and the agency, which should be seamless for New York.
Yeah, because it's just something that's so not regulated, right? Industry wide is
right.
compensation. So,
but we do such a good job with it right now. I think you guys do such a good job of saying to the surrogates, this is the benefit package, and she says, yeah, this is great, and you educate them about it ahead of time. So when the parents see it, everybody's on the same page. And it's good to have that because you don't want to be getting all the way through the screening, like Dr. Pinho said. The contract's the last part. You don't want to get there and then suddenly somebody go,
it's a little too late.
Yeah, I changed my mind. This is what we're going to do financially instead.
For sure. It's about transparency right from the get-go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Dr. Pinho was talking about the embryos and the testing of the embryos, and that harkens to part of the surrogate's Bill of Rights. That's really important because there is a whole section about the surrogate's right to make medical decisions about herself and about her health care, which it can sometimes override intended parents' rights about their child because the surrogate's the one who's pregnant. And a lot of people, particularly lawyers, read this and they go, what? But if you really think about it, if you really get to the heart of this, that's the same in every state. The surrogate always has the right to make decisions about herself. So I think that people just need to take a deep breath and think about it because it's not as scary as they might think it is. But she does have the right to make those healthcare and welfare decisions. She has the right of termination of pregnancy. So it's really good to psychologically, medically, and just socially talk to the parties about all of this long in advance so that there's no surprises. People feel the same way. There's, no surprises down the road. So I just wanted to mention those things.
And there is a huge, so for intended parents that are listening to us, there is a huge commitment. And I say this every single day because I'll say it out loud. There is always a surprise where you don't expect, because if the agency doesn't do a diligent job on this initial screening part, which can be social and also psychological screening, which I tell everyone it's an immense importance. Intended parents have a huge take on this. I usually will tell that I need always that psychological evaluation, and sometimes with all those safety guards, they can escape. You can look very well on a paper, I usually say. You can look very well in a picture because it was all produced and everything else. But I usually do 2 steps over this, and sometimes things don't even go correctly because you're trying so much and you're missing the most important, which is touch base with people. Doing that first initial, and depends on the clinics and depends on the agency so much. And I can assure you that for you as an intended parent, that job does and is done very well, but by the agency here. The other part is psychological evaluation. I usually touch base with the gestational carrier around the medical records time. Sometimes, not all agencies are very adept to that because the matching might not have occurred yet, but it's so important to, I usually say this, listen, we're all looking for red flags. As you are an intended parent listening to this right now, you're looking for red flags in the things that you're seeing. You're looking for an agency, you're comparing an agency, you're comparing a lawyer, you're comparing a doctor. You're trying to look for those red flags. We do the same thing. So I think it's extremely important not only to have that conversation, but when the gestational, and certain clinics do it differently, I always prefer for the gestational carrier to come and visit the facility on the screening time, not in a local facility, but with the physician. And I recommend this regardless if it would be with me or any other colleague of mine, to do it on the facility that you're going to actually do all the processing. Means I'm going to sit down and have about an hour, sometimes an hour and a half. I've done more than an hour. I've done so many different consultations and with so many different surprises that on that day, rarely is the case. But I've refused not from any of the agency here. I have never refused anyone, but I've come across multiple situations ever so often, they're not very common, where you are looking at a person and you're getting those red flags. And sometimes only the physicality of having the person in front of you transpires that. And I will tell all the intended parents that that's where choose your the choices that you're going to make, choose them wisely and correctly. Make really that Excel sheet comparing everyone, prices, and part of the gut feeling, part of not. But that's the important safety of the process that I'm trying always to tell intended parents. Do not take a face value on anything. Do not trust anyone, because I don't trust myself every day, because I put myself in check every day, as I think we all do, to make sure every single detail gets done every single day.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, for the intended parents, it's so overwhelming. We do this every day, so we know what we're looking for. But for intended parents, they may think they know what they're looking for, but then they're probably driving themselves crazy because it's something that maybe they shouldn't be looking for, because maybe it's not the most important, but they just, and then on the flip side of that, things that, they have to trust who their team is. And that is the doctor and the agency and the attorney. And you hit the nail on the head that we're always looking for those red flags as well. As an agency, we actually accept such a small percentage of the surrogates who apply. And we wish we could match all of our intended parents like yesterday, but it is such a unique process and to accept those surrogates. And we complete the psychological screenings up front for the surrogate and her partner, and we really definitely do our due diligence. And it's all about, I think, like I said, transparency and of course, education. I think you cannot educate the surrogate enough, as well as the intended parents. Here they're putting all of their trust and their hope and their dreams into all of us. So we certainly, none of us, I know you guys are amazing as well. We don't take it lightly. So yes. It's very humbling.
And also a word of hope for the intended parents, because, we've seen this, all of us. A gestational carrier, many times, is going to have such a different relationships with the intended parents, because the intended parents sometimes don't have, or don't want that closeness of a relationship, but many of our intended parents do, and many of our gestational carriers do. And I'm going to tell you as an intended parent, if you're watching this, that it is so important to have an agency that is educated and absorbed you as what they see in you as the best match for the conjugation of your gestational carrier. That is so vitally and important. I'm going to tell it out loud that my job gets diminished in all of this process, because it's so much more, the biological part is something that is static and physical and very determined and very, directed and focused and boring at most of the times, because I have to do just the same thing every single day, the same way to get, that success. But
I would not agree with boring.
After
nothing could be boring with you.
Right, you can't make anything boring.
Being 50, it's a repetitive job, yes, but I love it. But it's it's not as, for me and personally, it's not as important as the agency itself. Making sure that conjugation between, and the case coordinator, I completely continue to say the same thing. Your case coordinator, your agency is going to be so vital in matching you with the right gestational carrier. And it's not just a person. Most of the gestational carriers are waiting 7 to 8 years to do a decision of becoming a gestational carrier themselves. They want a very much altruistic. Yes, there is a compensation, but I tell you as an obstetrician, and this is my last word on this, so that you see the risk. A woman getting pregnant, it is the most risky moment of their personal lives. not passing, not crossing the road, not, not even menopause, not even, any other period, not even surgery, comparing to a pregnancy, which is the most risky period of most things that can happen to a woman. So we make it safe. There's going to be a safety. They stay with me for about 12 weeks, and then they go to their private OBGYNs or general OBGYNs that they chose. But it's such an important part that the agency needs to do. If that it conjugates well, many of gestational carriers, I can tell that I used to work with two wonderful people that they still to this day, one with the intended parents in Paris, the other one in Israel, and they go there. I mean, they don't even get paid a ticket. They pay themselves well, and before COVID, and they would visit. It's kind of the aunt. Well, not all the intended parents are going to have this relationship, but I want the intended parents to understand that it's not a cold-hearted business, because it's not a business. It's something that we take it to heart, and the gestational carriers absolutely the same way.
It's the most beautiful gift.
Forever, it's life-changing. The surrogates, when they make the decision to become a surrogate, I mean, they are putting, like you said, their life, on the line at that point in terms of a pregnancy, because you just never know what's going to happen, right? And it's full support from their entire family unit and their friends. And so it's a decision that, we certainly do not take lightly, when we are educating and supporting the surrogates. And that's something that I'm really proud of our agency, that we have such a phenomenal support group within our own agency. The team is just amazing. We have so many current and previous surrogates on our own staff, and I know Perla works super closely with the case management team as well, and just the level of support that they're provided, and even Perla that you provide to the team. It's just I'm really proud of them. I'm really proud of all of them.
You guys are amazing to work with. All the surrogates I get to work with, all the intended parents I get to work with you, are perfectly educated. They know exactly what to expect. It is a well-oiled machine, and that's why it's so important for parents to pick good professionals. And I think the only dispute the three of us might have is who has the better job.
We're all going to just point at each other.
Yep. I mean, we all get to do this every day. This is,
But likewise, I mean, you guys are amazing. And, when you're working with true professionals, our colleagues, it just makes all of our lives easier. And we appreciate one another that much more,
I always like to say your agency, your doctor, and your lawyer, we all join hands and we form a big circle around you, and we literally carry you through this whole journey. That is, we are your protective team, doing a little dance around you, getting you through this. And
it's just, we never stop thinking about them, whether, eating dinner or, whatever, going to bed at night, wake up in the morning. It's just, it's instilled in us. And I think it's just something that, we're all very blessed.
Because I know this for sure. In effect, throughout the years, there is a weekend, there's after hours, there is a small issue, a question. And I can assure all the intended parents that even for my own self, that we are, there's no weekends. There is no, we are here.
There's no 9 to 5.
You're in Australia, you're in Israel, you're in France, you're in Germany, you're in Spain, you're in France. It doesn't matter to us. You're in New York City, you're in Los Angeles. I mean, it's the same. I usually say to the intended parents, I would love to, for sleeping those 5 hours, because that's what I do every single day for many, many years. And if I do sleep 7, I already get into the groggy mode. But aside from that, we're here for you to make this journey safe. That's the most important thing. There are many aspects to it. I know that, it's like, we see something beautiful and we say, oh, we could make it with our own hands. And then we start to see how many things are involved and how much mechanism is involved. And yes, you need to make a choice. And hopefully you will come and talk to us and about those choices. If you're international, just mention that, and you would like to start the process and you see an impediment of traveling, touch base with us, because there are plenty of choice and options to go about, and to make sure that we do it safely. I travel all the time. I can travel to Europe. I'm European, I'm an American, so I'm a conjugation of both. And there is many opportunities to do that. I have offices there too. I have offices actually in Lisbon, and elsewhere that we're going to have offices too. So touch base with us. It's complimentary for most of what we do. We're here to inform. In my part, I usually say, listen, it's a conversation. I don't charge anything, because I think there's so many questions and there is so much going through until you make the final decision, that I'm always available. And I've always been throughout the years doing the same thing, which is my consultations are always complimentary, means free of charge, not because it releases the intended parent from, oh, I have one more question, I'm going to have to pay, for this or that. And if you choose something with us, and it's perfect. And if you're not, I'm always here. I've had intended parents that sometimes contact me for a second or third opinion. I'm not going to deter you from staying where you are. I'm here to help, as any of the other people that are here to help you and to navigate through all of this. That's
Speaking of international, how does it work with your team in terms of their sperm freeze and creating the embryos? We have representatives here at Family Source in France. He's Jerome. He speaks French and German, and we have a UK representative, Jessica. We have staff in China, Peter and Ben. And so in terms of intended parents wanting to start the process, and let's say they just can't get here. They want to create their embryos. They say they have an egg donor here chosen. Is it possible for your team then, for your center how does that work? Can you
Absolutely. That's actually one of the, I think, top questions right now. I would say top as the number one, because every consultation that I start is, I'm sorry, Dr. Pinho, I'm actually like I was saying, I had an intended parent in Australia that they're going to their second journey, and they wanted, because they didn't have sperm anymore with us, and they wanted to touch base. Different places will be different. And what do I say for this is precisely, each region of the world will have a different challenge. As it's a challenge because it's not immediately over here. The ideal would be, as before of COVID, you would come to New York, you would come to Connecticut, you would deposit your sperm sample, and that would be it. A couple of sperm samples or one sperm sample usually gives out what we call many vials, means usually often between 3 and 4 vials. What does this mean? The sample that we're going to acquire from you has many millions of sperm, and that we can divide by many vials, and each vial would be used for basically, a cycle, as we call it. I will always like to have a little bit more than one, because you want to have a backup. Now, how do we get the sperm over here? If it's, for example, from Europe, there is facilities that we work with, and basically they can, alongside, so in this process, there is an American portion of it, and there is an European portion of it. Each country will be different. Some countries need, for example, also the quarantine. Most countries won't need that in terms of sperm for the transportation to here. But in the United States, we need one thing which is called FDA. And we call it as FDAs, which is Food and Drug Administration, basically is just a list of criteria that needs to be assessed, not only into a regulation lab that is approved for the infectious diseases. And we can have that collected for the intended parent and shipped over overnight, and that's something that we can do. And here's going to be the caveat for New York that you don't see it coming. The other portion of it is we need also a physical examination, also for the intended parent, and that's where many times, we have a few intervals where I go to a certain place and, I see the intended parent and there is a physical examination, or there is a certified medical doctor in the American system away from, it can be in Europe, it can be in Israel, it can be in China, it can be in Australia, anywhere else, that can do also that part, but it needs to be all very well regulated. For the transport, you don't have to worry about, because freezing is a very already a very good process where nothing is going to happen to it. It's you put nitrogen in it and it's carried over, usually overnight. It doesn't take very long, even if it gets sometimes, there's customs anywhere in the world, and usually the customs and the transporting company that will be responsible for the sample will do that very safely. And there's more than a few that we work with. Depending on the area of the world, will take maybe a little bit longer. I would be saying that, countries that are going to be more challenging are going to be from Asia right now, as you can imagine, because there's going to be a lot of regulations that actually are not in place yet completely, because we have two organizations here in the United States. Sorry for the big lesson, but American Society of Reproductive Medicine, which I belong to, and there is a review community that I've been attached to throughout the years, and there is a lot of regulation that we go through and updates on those regulations. As you can imagine, COVID is going to be something that is going to be looked out and sought out as one of the regulations for all this process. It's really not established yet, because there's a lot of gaps that we have in knowledge right now. So we have also to be very safe with that. There's going to be waivers, there's going to be a lot of things that we need to do. When we do a waiver, so in this process, when we transport the sperm, we are going to actually do a waiver for the same thing that would be comparable to New York. And when you do a waiver, I didn't explain thoroughly that we need to have a directed donor. And the process also with the gestational carrier is that she needs to become aware. So there is an information there that we need to tell her what the source of the sperm is. And your egg donor, if you're using one, needs to also be aware of and know you in certain level. It doesn't have to be a level of connaissance where they're best friends with you. No, they need to know, or at least access your information, and depending on what they want and need. But that is what we call directed donor, or comparing to the opposite, which would be an unknown donor. For the process of transportation, again, usually takes about a week or so for the sperm, or sometimes 48 hours for the sperm to get to us. And we immediately test the sperm immediately. There's, imagine as, that vial or those 5 vials, usually 4 vials that come over, we're going to test each one with a little bit of scraping to see if the process was good, if the sperm is good, if there is any issues whatsoever, or in terms of the comparison between the results that we were provided from the facility in Europe, for example, and what we have here in when we get. The last part is, where can we use this? Because we're focusing so much on New York. That's where it gets a little bit more dicey and complicated. And I would suggest this is because there's a lot of factors over here. Could you use it in New York? Here is the fact that New York is a little bit different, or a lot different, in the regulations for sperm in comparison to other states. There's a lot of regulation right now with the layering on top of a surrogacy law that is still not, certainly defined on little aspects, like, for example, the transportation of sperm at this stage. I would say that the conjugation of all the legislation would be probably more facilitated in the Connecticut, because it has certain already vehicles and statements that are very well defined that are not so defined in New York. So that would be the creation of embryos, I would suggest, to be created in Connecticut and to be transferred in Connecticut. That would be my avail at this stage until we have the definition for that. Again, all this process is not very complicated. The waivers are not complicated, but they need to be made aware for all parties involved: egg donor, gestational carrier, and the most important person that we're talking about, you as intended parent or intended parents, need that information so that you can make also your, personal decision. Now, can you wait until, next year to come over here? Of course you can. Does it make a difference in the quality of the sperm? Absolutely not. The clinics and the facilities that we work with all throughout the world, they're extremely capable. Many of the times, most of the times actually, either I will be involved or a colleague that I have the most confidence with will be involved, that I know personally. So it's something that is going to be safe. Genetics and everything else needs to still be done. And that's the last part that I wanted to kind of, merge all this together, because intended parents are really focusing on, okay, I want my sample there. I want maybe my egg donor to be tested. And they need themselves to get genetic testing themselves. That gets in the same, we call it Viromed kit, which is a kit that we have as blood, and we introduce an extra vial of blood, which it's not much more. You're not going to lose much more blood because of this, but it gets us a complete full screening of more than 300 alterations and mutations on the genetics itself that we can compare with your egg donor or even recipient in that case, where we make sure that there is not a possibility of creating, if most of the diseases that we have are what we call either recessive or dominant. Dominant, you just need one gene, and we think of us as father and mother, and we have always two genes for the same thing, one from the mother, one from the father. If one is affected and you're dominant, that would be a disease. And that's rare because dominant diseases are a lot more rare. And the recessive ones, which are much more common, and there is a long list of these ones, we can make sure that if the gestational carrier we don't care about the gestational carrier because there's no aggregation to her. But the egg donor or the recipient, if that is one gene that is altered and the intended parent father has a gene that is altered, you can do a 2x2 table and figure out there is a 25% chance of then the child to be born with that defect. We want to make sure that that doesn't happen. If it's a recipient, means if you want to use your eggs and the sperm is also affected, there is still ways, very, very clean ways, where we would build what we call a probe to go and get that defect and make sure that we wouldn't be using those embryos. This is, I know it's overwhelming what I'm posing as the layers of things, but in the simplest way is touch base with us. We'll organize that collection of sperm. You might have to travel inside of Europe, which can be challenging between certain countries right now, but it is possible. And we just need to coordinate it very well with you. And then with our office in Connecticut, we will coordinate everything. And the young ladies over here also will take over.
Thank you so much.
The topic of the genetic testing, you just mentioned the genetic testing that is done on the egg donor and the sperm donor. What about doing genetic testing on the embryos? Is that something that you advise the intended parents when they are using an egg donor?
So there's two levels, and I know that intended parents sometimes they say, well, can we test the embryo on every single genetic disease? Perla, that's a great question, because there is a misperception that we are able right now to do that genetic testing. We can do many things already with the intended parents, because when we collect the blood, it's a lot of genetic material in the blood. Just by less than a millimeter, we have thousands of cells that we can test for. Now, in an embryo, differently, we have usually, in the more standard way, we let the embryos develop, and usually they're about third day, there are 6 or 8 cells. In Europe, that's when they test it. We don't test at that moment, because 6 or 8 cells and you're taking 2 of them because you need always something to compare with. You remain with an embryo with 4 cells to 6 cells. And we know now that there's a lot of lower rates for fertility when we do the biopsy. In Europe, it's not permissible, and in the European Union, let me put it this way, to do that biopsy on a further later date, which is day 5 to day 6. The reason is, I'll mention it if any of the intended parents are listening, it comes from the Second World War, which is genetic manipulation, and because embryos at that stage have a lot of stem cells, and there is a worrisome on the European Union side. We have also strict guidelines. There is no genetic manipulation over here, but we take not even from the baby, we take only from the placenta. This is important for the intended parents where, so we're going to biopsy the embryo, and we're going to do genetics on the embryo, but we're going to harm the baby. Well, there is always a possibility of harming, but it's very extremely low these days because we take those cells, 3 to 4 or 5 cells from the placenta side. We call it trophoblast. Doctors like to give horrible names for, normal common things, which is just, it's the part of the placenta. We're going to take a few cells and we're going to compare. Just to tell you, we can even these days, and this is still in a very already progressed way, but experimental still stage, which is we can actually, from the cells that the baby sheds and deposits on the culture medium, we can take those cells, which is called the non-invasive genetic testing, and we can test on that. Still, it still needs to work a few kinks. We need more data to actually have the same validity. We're thinking that we have the same validity, but in science, we always need to be cautious and not take anything as the holy grail. But what it means in the end is that we're going to have genetics on the baby itself. What can we test on that is threefold, 3 things. One is what I used to do in pharmacy. I started as a pharmacist and then became a doctor, which I call spending a lot of money for my parents. And we used to do just sustain, which is what we're going to do, a karyotype. Karyotype counts, remember when I was mentioning before the number of chromosomes that we have, 1 from mom, 1 from dad. We're only supposed to have 2 in each position. There's 23. The 23rd is supposed to be an XY or an XX, and there's only 1 XY over here, and the other ones are XXs, and the other 3 ladies. And we are going to be able to see that. But you also see if there's more than 2, 3, 4 chromosomes in one place, that would be, rare, but it can happen. Translocations means, genetic material that goes from one chromosome to the other, and it's not supposed to happen. Trisomy 21 is a good example of this, where on position 21, Down syndrome, it's supposed to be only there 2 chromosomes, and then all of a sudden there is 1 extra chromosome. So we can detect those things. In about a few years, we are going to be able to, with this new machinery that we're coming up in, a lot of genetic techniques that I'm still involved actually with some of the Newberry and New York Stem Cell Foundation, that I still am aggregated with them. And one of the good PIs that is over there, which is Dieter, and he is amazing. Dieter Agley is amazing in his research that he's doing. We're trying to figure out even how to sequence more of that very low quantity of genetic material. But remember, anything in science is not 100% until we get the system very well done. So we can test, can we test for all those genetic diseases? We could, but not really. The technique is not there right now that we can implement for the public. Probably, I would say in a few years, hopefully we're going to get there. What we can do is, if we know, for example, and I have a lot of intended parents with, let's say, cystic fibrosis, one of the most common things in Europe and in the United States as a carrier stage. And I can tell you that we can pinpoint, because there's so many mutations for cystic fibrosis and so many variations to it. And when you test negative, not necessarily all tests are created equal, and it might be a false negative in those cases. We can actually do probes very well, targeting certain portions of the DNA that we know that they're going to be the places where the disease is going to be at, and we can be very efficient. It takes a little bit longer, about a month, to create that probe. We need blood from the intended parents, but that's that's, I would say, seamless right now, but it used to be extremely complicated because, the methodology 10 years ago almost didn't exist, and now it's certainly common in every genetic lab. So we can do that. Testing an overall, there is also mitochondria, and we've done that for many years. I'm going to say that the data there is a little bit less strong. The thought process is that I'm old, I'm 50 years old, turned this year. Means that my version when I was 25 years old had probably less number of mitochondria, and they had less mutations. What this means is that the better that you are as a functioning cell, the more effective and the more efficient you are with a lesser number and with less mutations. Why do we age? Well, wrinkles and everything else, because that genetic material gets deteriorated throughout the time, and more mutations come, and then we become less efficient, and then we need more mitochondria. So the thought process was that an embryo that had a lot of mitochondria and had a lot of mutations was lesser than an embryo that had less mitochondria with less mutations. That is really, the data there is a little bit not strong, and I still do it as, something that we can aggregate onto genetic testing, but I wouldn't recommend it as, a primary thing that you would follow. And that's basically, there's many more things, but I could stay here like for the next 2 hours, but I've already occupied too much time.
Thank you so much. That's super helpful. I do want to close our webinar. Back to Molly. I want to just finalize what we were touching on in terms of the pre-birth order. I'd say PBO, pre-birth order. In New York. I know you started touching on that. So if we can close it with your thoughts and
Sure.
expectations for that in New York.
So basically, as long as there is strict compliance, that is the word used in the statute, strict compliance with the law, then you can be granted the pre-birth order. Now, you can file any time after the contract is signed, which is really interesting. But of course, I would recommend not worrying about filing until we know if we've got a nice, good, solid pregnancy, how many babies you're pregnant with, that sort of thing. But yeah, so it's just, it'll be a series of declarations. It mirrors many of the other states, a series of declarations from all the parties. It also covers the contract. So you'll submit a copy of the contract, and then you'll get that judgment of parentage back.
And this is for all intended parents, whether they're heterosexual, same sex, married, single. Okay.
Just
great.
with that one little caveat about if you're married but not proceeding with your marital partner. Yeah.
Right. And what about if there were, say, if the embryos had no genetic link at all to the intended parents? Is that still considered a surrogacy?
Right. So the only thing excluded in the statute is if the surrogate is genetically linked to the child. So that would be, like, as Dr. Pinho said, that is traditional surrogacy. That is not something that the statute covers. And it is a requirement that the surrogate not be any genetic link.
No. Okay, perfect. So if it was donated embryos, it's still completely fine.
Yeah.
Great. So super exciting for New York.
Yes.
Question for you ladies, which I think is going to be important for intended parents, which is for our international intended parents. It is very important for them to have not only the legal portion with us very correctly done, but when they go back home, I usually say they need some guidance. We all use historically probably the same people, but a little bit of the guidance that they need. Probably the question is, how do you go about in counseling them if somebody's from Germany, somebody's from France, and there's legal statutes so different. Switzerland, for example, which is all different completely, I would say not difficult, but challenging sometimes, depending on the cases. How do you go about in helping the intended parents so that they can also have a little bit of enlightenment in that?
I have a two-step answer for you. Step number one is, because we discussed specifically with New York, you do need to be a U.S. citizen. But if you're a married couple and one of you is not a U.S. citizen, that's fine, as long as one of you is. There's just a one-person requirement there. So you theoretically could live in Germany as long as you're married to an American. And you're not also American. Of course, you can also both be American. You know what I'm saying? So, so that's step one. Step two of the answer is, if you will be returning to a home country and you plan to raise the child there, then you absolutely should speak to an attorney in your home country from the beginning, from before you are signing contracts, because there are certain requirements for certain countries that need to go into the original contract, because your country is going to look at that contract. So we can set you up for success if we know that that is your plan. So make sure that you have that discussion with your attorney and your legal team ahead of time.
And that is something we can always help as well. If they need connections, we can reach out to our American attorneys, such as Molly, and they can certainly, I'm sure, help as well.
Yeah, we have a really good line on everything that's needed in all the different countries. I'm surprised the capacity in my brain. It's like, okay, so for France, we need this. Germany, we need this. China, we need this. It's just like those things that you know. And
we get a lot of questions too in terms of the international intended parents. Let's say it's a same-sex couple. They're a little confused in terms of, let's say they're returning home to France. Can both of their names be on the birth certificate? So, and you just see this, you know, with different countries. So it's always, like you said, to get that education and talk to an attorney beforehand. It's for sure.
With COVID, how long is it taking the intended parents to get back home?
Is this a COVID question, a pre-COVID or post-COVID?
So when their baby is born, how long is it taking them to get the paperwork in order to go back home?
This varies from state to state. The states that allow for pre-birth orders, the parents can usually return home a lot sooner because they already have one of the big steps done prior to the birth. Right now with COVID, birth certificates are taking a little bit longer in many places, not all, but many. And the reason for this is because a lot of government offices are working on minimal staff, different types of hours, people working from home to accommodate COVID. Basically, you only need 3 things to go home. The first one is a healthy baby. The second thing is a birth certificate, and the third thing is a passport. Right now, if you are unable to get that US passport, you can travel home on some other travel documents, depending on where you live. In Europe, we can do a laissez-passer in a lot of countries. A lot of other countries are issuing the home country passport for you. Sometimes you just need a travel permission. It just varies. So your legal team should be doing all of that for you and with you. So make sure that you're chatting with them about it. If you have a healthy baby and everything is looking good, I would estimate about 3 weeks right now. If it's a state where you have to get a judgment of parentage after the birth, or maybe birth certificates are taking longer, that can extend for sure.
Let me give just a little bit of an insight, because I've been involved, like Molly said so well, which is, do you mean before COVID?
Yeah.
During COVID? Because many of the intended parents, and they have gotten into the point where they have become even scared, which is, okay, you've told me all of this and I understand and it's going to be safe and I'm ready to start, but I'm afraid that, you know, I'm not going to be able to bring my own child. So in the beginning, there was actually a very limitation for traveling. They wouldn't even offer the possibility of intended parents getting a visa to come over here, the ones that would necessitate, you know, that. But right now, the processes between, and I'm going to tell out loud, Molly, Richard, and a bunch of other, you know, legal statutes has been already very well established, where the team, and I usually, you know, have already letters prepared for the necessity of the parents.
Yep, that's part of the packet. Yep.
Which is, and it needs to be in place immediately. I'll mention not their names, of course, because I have about more than 20 stories on this, but my later ones were Austrian couple, actually, that they had a little bit of difficulties, and I was telling them it's going to be, you know, difficult to get the passport for you to return home. And that was historically in the beginning of COVID. Right now, just for intended parents to know, you're going to get a passport, which is going to be an American passport for your child, for you to travel back. Now, you don't have a restriction to go back yourself, but you want to wait until you have that legal documentation. As Molly said, you have a pre-birth order, you're a little bit ahead of time because you have already that birth certificate that you need to send out to have your passport done. Now, certain intended parents, and they're not, this Austrian couple was actually not the first one doing it, but actually very successfully doing it. And thereafter, I actually gave the same formulation to others. In their case, they actually scheduled a consultation for Washington. They went for it, they got there, and they had the process seamlessly. It was a same-sex couple. It was, I actually had 2 huge letters of necessity for each one, one section, maybe one section actually personally, because there were personal things on him, and they had no issues whatsoever.
Coming here?
Yes, coming
Yeah.
here.
We've had no issues getting people here too. You've got, just like you said, you've got to plan. You have to plan, and you have to plan long in advance. You have to compile the thing, but there's an exception to the travel ban that allows people to come here, and their lawyers should be doing this with them. So do not be afraid. We have successfully gotten everybody here.
And back, which is
back. Yeah.
That you get your passport, and they got it in the same day that it was not even 24 hours. They went to Washington. Now, if you're going to a different state and your stationary carrier is in a different state, do not worry about, you can actually do the interview over the phone these days, because they're offering that. You don't need necessity of a Zoom call or anything. And usually in a few days, they have an expedited fee that you will apply, which is something like $100 or something like that you will have your passport returned for your child, and then you can travel without any restrictions whatsoever. And that's it. Okay. Just wanted to share my experience, because Molly and I and Staci and Perla probably
we've done a lot of these. Yeah.
Yes, for sure. It certainly is crazy times right now, but I feel that there's light at the end of the tunnel for sure.
Yeah. Right now it's a very efficient process. I don't want the intended parents to think that there is any issues with that, because like Molly said, preparation, anticipation is the most important thing.
Absolutely. And it's really forced a lot, the legal and everybody really to get a head start on it and be well prepared. So again, I think, I don't think anybody should put a limitation anymore on moving forward at all. I think we're all very well prepared for sure. So anyways, thank you, everybody. You've been amazing, all of you.
Thank you. It's what an esteemed group of colleagues. Thank you.
I'm
flattered to be with all of you.
I said this off camera, and I'll say this in camera, this is an amazing group of people that I've created. We have the privilege of finding people that we work not only well with, but we find them as, good friends and above the professionalism, because I think that's the baseline for all that we do. And I really, really am grateful to be here and informing you as an intended parent too. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Perla.
No, thank you. It's an honor to be here amongst you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And I'm sure that the audience learned so much from all of you. So it's amazing. So until next time, right?
Yep.
All right. Well, everybody have a wonderful day, and yay for New York. We're all excited to go there and make some babies. So thanks again, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of the week. And we'll all be in touch soon.
Good.
Be in touch soon.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.